Spacefarer. Welcome to WTUFO. I'm Caleb Mayo. Hope you're enjoying watching or listening. You can support the show now on YouTube or Patreon or Buzzsprout. All three places, Patreon, YouTube, and Buzzsprout, will let you become a subscribing member of WTUFO. You can support us for as little or as much per month as you would like. There might be a couple perks, but the basic idea is you can just help us continue to make the show. This would mean an absolute ton to us. I hope you're enjoying the show. We're having a blast talking to these brilliant people and doing deep dives about the scientific revolution unfolding around UFOs. We're also really enjoying your comments on YouTube and X, so please keep engaging. Tell us more about what you'd like to see or what your ideas about the phenomenon are, and please support us on either Patreon or YouTube or Buzzsprout, or continue to listen for free. That's a fine option too. Hope you enjoy the episode. Have a great day. What the UFO? I'm here with investigative journalist Leslie Kean. Leslie, it is an honor to meet you.
Great to meet you too, Caleb. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for being here. For the two people in the world who might not know, Leslie is the author of UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record, as well as Surviving Death, a journalist investigates evidence for an afterlife. She's also a producer on UFOs, Investigating the Unknown. You can watch both seasons of that on Hulu right now. And she's quite famously a freelance journalist who's broken some of the biggest stories in recent UFO history, including the 2017 New York Times article about black money in the Pentagon, revealing the existence of AATIP, and more recently, the article in the Debrief, also with Ralph Blumenthal, that brought David Grusch's claims to the world. So over to you, Leslie. Did I sum up your recent UFO work well? And how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I think you summed it up very well, Caleb. Yeah, thank you. There were a whole series of stories that followed the 2017 one. Though there was one in May of 2019, which was when we brought Ryan Graves forward. And, which is really cool because we all know how much he has done since then. But and that story in May of 2019 actually got more views than the 2017 story did, which is astonishing. Yeah, I don't think most people know that. It was the 10th most read story in the whole New York Times for the year of 2019.
Wow, cool.
I know, it's really at the end of every year they list their 100 most read stories from the first to the to the 100th, and we were number 10. Just pretty amazing.
That's got to feel good.
It does feel good, and I think people love that story because it talked a lot about what the pilots were actually seeing. It talked more about the phenomenon as opposed to the first one, which was all about the program, the AATIP program, and how it got funded and how it got started and all that. But the videos were a big part of that first story too. It's a lot of what attracted people to it. And those videos are still shown all over the place. You can't watch I don't know if you've noticed this, but whenever you see a newscast on UFOs, they always are showing those videos.
Yeah. So
they're like part of the culture now.
You're right. They became some of the most important tape that we've ever seen in this subject.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was like all exciting. And it's just harder to write stories now than it was then. But Ralph and I are continuing to do our best. That's
interesting. Why is it harder now?
I think because the New York Times is just not as receptive or not as interested, apparently, in what Ralph and I have to offer them. And I think it may be that the whole crash retrieval element of this is just too much for them. A paper like that is so rigorous that they just demand a level of proof for things that isn't possible when the information they want is classified. So it's harder for them to write a story just based on what people say, even if they're very high level people that are not going to be lying. It's just not, it's just not going to be something that's enough for them, I don't think. It's just a level of demand that they have, which is frustrating because, when we have good, really, really highly credible people on the record, all saying the same thing about something as amazing and as newsworthy as a program which possesses crashed UFOs. It seems to me like that's a story, but I think for them, they would want to see the documents and the photographs or whatever else to really prove that. It's not enough. So that's sort of, I think, so the more we advance in some ways, the harder it is for us to get stories in the mainstream media because we're dealing with more extreme kind of scenarios now, right? But But the Times was instrumental in kind of getting the ball rolling, of course. And we did a whole series of stories for them that were really important, getting us to where we are today. But it is harder. And I think the other element is that so much of the news now is put out on either social media or through podcasts and videos. And people are just more interested in putting things out in that way. And so less people are reading some of the mainstream papers than they used to. And I don't know, the mainstream, the Washington Post, the New York Times just are a little shy still about covering this topic. And the New York Times has a reporter who covers things like, if there's a congressional hearing or something, they'll write a little story about that, but that's about as far as it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to go a few places with this. One is to ask, do you think it's difficult for them to cover anything, for mainstream media in general, to cover anything that is a repeat claim? So if it's been made already, they just don't want to write an article because the news of the claim has already broken?
Yeah, absolutely. Every time we've gone to the New York Times, we have to offer them an exclusive. So Ralph and I were not on staff there, just also so people understand what a freelancer is. We're freelancers, which means we will get a story and then we'll make a pitch to the New York Times and say, we've got this story. Are you interested? And yeah, I mean, if the story it's got to be something that's exclusive to them. That's a very good point you're making. So if the story is already out there, they're not going to be interested in it. It's not their story. So that's another problem we have, is that when people are excited, people just put things out all the time on podcasts and social media. They're not saving it for Leslie and Ralph to put in the New York Times. I wish they would. I wish more people would realize that if something comes out in the New York Times, it's going to have way more impact than it can have anywhere else, really, especially than it can have on a UFO podcast on YouTube or something, But people don't think like that anymore. Everybody's just getting their stuff out. It's on, X and Twitter and wherever else it comes out fast. So that's another issue. We need exclusive stories. We need people that will come forward to us and say, here's a story for the Times. We take it to the Times, and nobody talks about it until it's out. Right. But even the David Grusch story, we had that. And, the Times just passed on it. And I'm pretty sure it was because the complaint that anybody who wants to be critical of him has made is that he doesn't have proof or data of what he's actually saying. It's secondhand information, all that kind of stuff. That's not going to, but at least we had the exclusive story with him. And when we put it out in the debrief, it still was exclusive. Nobody knew it was coming out. I mean, well, actually, that's not true. It leaked, but it was an exclusive first time story. And then it went out on News Nation with the interview that Ross Coulthard did. So it was a kind of a combination of those two things.
That goes to a second question I had in this area, which is about documents and documentation. The hesitance of mainstream respected blue chip media to run stories without documents, while honorable, seems to provide an easy out for, say, like intelligence organization that is trying to avoid leaking information. I wonder what you think about just the idea of verbal only agreements. Like, as somebody who's looked into this deeply as a journalist, do you think that it is the case that some deep secret parts of the intelligence community operate without documentation and maybe do so on purpose? Is that a crazy question to ask? Or
no, you mean there's no written record for reasons of not wanting there to be any record? I mean, I wouldn't know, because all that happens deep inside these special access programs. But I'm sure, I've heard that, that may be the case, that they don't keep records of certain things. But I can't say for sure, Sure. But even if they did keep records, they would never be accessible to anybody without the clearances who's not actually read into that program and has a need to know. I mean, there's so many levels you have to go through to get access to any of it that it's never going to be accessible. And so, if it's something that's classified, like the crash retrieval programs, you can acknowledge they exist, but you cannot talk about any of the specific aspects of any of them without clearances. And the thing to know is that the members of Congress who are behind this are behind it because they've received the classified briefings. They know the specifics. They know the details. They know where things are, who's running the programs, how long they've been going, where the objects were retrieved, all of this stuff. And, it's sometimes frustrating that they're not doing more with that information. I don't know what they can do with that information, but they have it. And those are people like Chuck Schumer and Mike Rounds, who are the ones that have written the legislation and who are passionate about getting more transparency. They know a lot more than we do.
That's an extremely important point.
It is, yeah. And that's what people have to realize when they say, we don't have any proof or we don't know proof. Those people have it. They have the information. And from a lot more than just the people we know about. I mean, there's the Dave Grusch and there's Jake Barber and people like that. But they've heard from many other people with similar information who have not gone public, many. So they have this incredible treasure trove of information. And they know this is real. They know this is true. And, I don't know what Congress can actually do. I wouldn't know what capacity they have to. I don't think they're an investigative body, so they can do hearings. And, there's just something has to happen with all that information. That doesn't seem to be happening, but they have it. That's the important thing.
Staying in the journalism world, it's frustrating that fact and information hasn't inspired more of a kind of logical approach to some investigation from other organizations than, say, the work that you've done. Because as you're sort of implying here, somebody has this information in a validated way. So that suggests that there's something to go ask people about. So actually, in a minute, I want to ask for your advice to other journalists about how to go about that. But I wanted to click one more kind of like intelligence community idea here. And I'm not exactly sure how to frame this, but the idea of deliberate deception comes up sometimes in this space. And you and Ross Coulthard and other journalists have discussed the possibility that in some cases, members of the military agencies or intelligence agencies might be defending organizations and programs that they are legally required to hide. And so when I first encountered that idea as a layperson, it seemed a little wild to me, and I wasn't sure how to approach it. And I've spent some weird nights trying to Google where's the part of the military code that says you have to lie about a secret program. So I wanted to bring that question to you and ask, is it in fact the case that there are programs within military and intelligence agencies that require people who know about them to deny they exist?
There are, yeah, and that's absolutely correct. They're required to lie about them. I mean, ideally, they would want to not have to comment at all. But if pressed, they are not allowed to acknowledge the existence of these programs. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So, we're never going to, it's just an impossible world to penetrate as a reporter. I mean, and that's what's holding it up. None of the specific information is accessible. And so if the New York Times wants it, they're stuck. They can't report, they won't report it. But yeah, it's absolutely true. The security for these special access programs at high levels and not just UAP, of course, across the board, right? Mm-hmm. Just so tight and so tightly controlled that they have to lie. Yeah. So.
That's pretty mind-blowing. And
I know, right?
Yeah. And it's a really tough challenge if you're like coming at this from a good faith, hardcore investigative point of view. I guess next natural question is, what would you recommend to people who have like a hard-nosed interest in getting the truth? If you're other journalists like you, maybe you're calling from the Washington Post or NBC, who would you want to call and what would you want to ask them?
Well, I mean, I feel like I've kind of done, I have lots of sources who I speak to. I've gathered enough information to know that this is true, but it's not classified information. But I think, calling up any military intelligence, former military, active military, pilots, people with, and members of Congress or their staff. Most of the staff can't talk to journalists, but just develop a network of very, very high level credible sources. And you can talk to them off the record and you'll find this overlap of what they're saying. I mean, you talk to enough people, and I've been doing this, since way before 2017. independent people who tell you the same thing, but they can't get into the specifics of it. Nobody can get that without clearances. So no matter how many reporters want to call up, Chuck Schumer or Senator Rounds or anybody else, or speak to top level military people who know the details, they're not going to get them. Nobody's going to break their security oaths on that level, but they've been able to do that with members of Congress. They've been able to go into a secure environment and tell them everything, or I think a lot. I don't know about everything, but a lot. So it's all a matter of whether you have clearances or not, whether you can get access to this information. So I don't really know what else any reporter can do, but I would encourage them to not be so demanding of documents or photographs or data, hard data, for something where it's not possible to provide it, but to just really focus on the credibility and honesty and sincerity and intentions of the sources, and just talk to them enough that you can assess that and see how much there is an overlap among all of them. I mean, that's all you can really do. And then we can just keep pushing our members of Congress, keep pushing the authorities to be more transparent and to find ways to unlock some of the documents that are now classified, like the Schumer amendment was trying to do, right? Like this task force that Luna has set up hopes to do. I don't know if they'll be successful because they only have 6 months. But there are some efforts among officials to become, to liberate some of these classified documents, which I don't know how much more they'll tell us, but it's a slow process. But all we can do is just keep, the pressure on and keep the requests going with the support of the people to learn more and for the government to release more. But we can't expect to get classified information told to us and then report on that. It's just not going to happen. So we're all kind of just have done what we can do. Keep digging, keep trying to get more, and just keep the pressure on.
It seems like one of the harder parts of journalism, that you have to do a lot of research that doesn't necessarily go anywhere. You might build stories that you don't get to write eventually.
Right. No, that's very true. There's so much time spent that no one ever knows you're spending. Even if it's just talking to off the record sources and developing relationships with key people, right? And you keep up with them, and they're never going to give you a story, maybe. And you know it, but you want to talk to them. We go down following leads that don't go anywhere, or the source turns out to be, not competent, or, they have something, but they don't follow through with it. I had one source who had a video that thought I could bring forward from a ship, and he was willing to come forward, and then we were going to talk again, and then I get a text that, oh, I'm sorry, I've been threatened, I've been harassed, I'm sorry, I just can't do this. So this happens too. There's a lot of risk for these people, and there's a lot of pushback on people coming forward. And as we know, David Grusch was subjected to that, and a lot of people we don't even hear about. So that's another component of why we don't get more stories and more news about this, and why so many of these people, whistleblowers or just witnesses or whatever, people with information who talk to Congress, this is why they don't want to be public about it. It's too risky. They have families, right? They have jobs that they want to maintain. So it's terrible, the kind of threats and harassment that people have to face if they do go public on this. But it makes the job of the journalist way harder.
This is a related question that might seem slightly flip, given the seriousness of your point about whistleblowers. But if you had a magic wand and you could make somebody talk to you, who would you tap in the sort of military and intelligence architecture to have a frank conversation with?
You mean
Chairman, Joint Chiefs, Director of National
any of those
Intelligence.
people, but a frank conversation, I don't know how you would define that. I mean, usually conversations with really high level people don't go very far. They have their talking points. It's all, if you get to anyone at that level, they have to get approval, even at high levels, to talk to you in the first place. You have to go through a spokesperson for the DOD, Susan Goff, to get access to anybody at AARO, for instance. And
Yeah.
then they're completely controlled in terms of what they're allowed to say and not to say. It's in some ways it's just very, very frustrating and very tightly controlled. So I couldn't say specifically who, but the people I'm most interested in speaking to are the ones who have come forward to Congress and have not been public yet.
Okay.
Other whistleblowers who have really interesting things to say and interesting experiences and firsthand knowledge and so on. And we don't even know who they are yet. I mean, I would be fascinated to talk to any of those people. And and a lot of the other people who I do talk to, and some of them are public, some of them are people that were in this recent film that just premiered.
Age of Disclosure.
Age of Disclosure, yeah. A lot of those people I've known for years and years, and they can only say so much, just like they could in the movie, because their stuff is classified. So, I would love to talk more to the people who have not come forward yet, but have some really important information to contribute.
And just double clicking on that, do you know, as a matter of fact, that such whistleblowers exist who have testified to Congress but have not gone public?
Absolutely, for a fact, yeah. And I wouldn't use the word testify. Has a very specific definition. Yeah, it's just people toss the word around, but the word that kind of means by definition that you're under oath if you're testifying.
Good point. So these people may have met with aides. They
would meet with congressional staffers in secure environments in a skiff where they can talk at a classified level, or maybe not in some of the meetings. They'd have to be set up in various ways, depending on the level of information they're going to provide. But absolutely, I know for a fact that there have been many who have done that, and we don't even know their names at this point. And I'm glad we don't, because they deserve protection. I'm not saying I want anyone to leak it or anything like that, but I would, I'd really love to talk to some of those people if I had an opportunity to do so. So
I would love to hear what you could get out of that.
Me too. I would like to hear.
Since you brought up skiffs, that's an interesting question that a lot of these, the official testimony to Congress has included answers like, I could tell you that in a skiff, or let's get in a skiff. And then outside in the public, it feels like we don't hear follow-up on that. Are you aware of behind the scenes follow-up that has included secure compartmented informational facilities? Or some people seem to have the impression that, like, Grusch offered to talk to people in skiffs, and then the committees never followed up with him about that, and he may not have. Do you know more about that?
I mean, I'm not sure if he actually went into a skiff or not, and I know that you're right. There've been, people have been saying that, we wanted to get him in a skiff. Well, like Tim Burchett would say, there are powers above the level of the actual members who want access to these people that I think have some kind of control over what they can do and who they can talk with and in what kind of environment. And I just think they get blocked, in a lot of the efforts that they're trying to accomplish. And they can't do it and often it's like a bureaucratic type reason, or, some legal block that they have, that somebody has to do something before they can get in the skiff or whatever. It's just all these complexities that come around and make it difficult. It's not as easy as you might think.
And it's not always clear where that block comes from. Like, it could come from Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, saying, no, we're not going to request this skiff, or it could come from the military or intelligence side blocking access to a skiff. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say more likely the Mike Johnson's kind of scenario, somebody within the congressional universe, but it also may be some kind of bureaucratic, some small point in some kind of manifesto that controls how this whole thing works. And I don't know exactly specifically what they are. I just know that the members have talked about coming up against all kinds of roadblocks and they would never say if it was an individual or whatever, but they just come up against roadblocks. It's not as easy as you would think. But nonetheless, there's been a lot of people who have spoken to members of Congress, and especially the Senate Intelligence Committees and the Armed Services Committees and those committees. So that's a good thing. It's a really great thing, and I hope it continues. But, the question is what's going to happen with all that information? Yeah, we don't really know. Not much has happened yet.
Right.
And put it that way.
It doesn't always seem easy to get it from a classified state to some kind of public disclosure. Not capital D, just little d.
Yeah.
You mentioned another sort of block and tackle operation when you said AARO and Sue Goff are in front of a lot of these requests. And I was just curious about your read on the current situation with AARO and Susan Goff. Can you help me understand their part in this dynamic currently?
Yeah, I mean, so we have a new director of AARO now, right? John Kozlowski, who everybody who knows him, people I know who know him, speak highly of him, and they have a lot more hope that AARO will maybe be a little more transparent and a little more, interested in real investigation now than they were under Kirkpatrick. And I think under Kirkpatrick, they were very focused on gathering data and kind of getting set up. And then they had this requirement to do this historical report for Congress, which nobody thought was worth much. But they had to spend a lot of time doing that report. So they weren't really putting their energies into where we might have liked them to put it. And of course, there were problems with them. I mean, there were a lot of problems under Kirkpatrick that I think people are aware of. And I think, so we don't really know what's going to happen under Kozlowski, but it seems that people are more positive about what things that might happen there. And there's more of an interest now in from AARO to really investigating things, and being more open about what they don't know. But we haven't seen a whole lot. I think they're due for another report that hasn't come out yet.
Are they charged with delivering one public report every year?
I think it's something like that. I think they're supposed to do part 2 of their initial report that they did for Congress that people were so critical of. I think there's supposed to be a second report that it was due in March or something. It's due right around now. Yeah. So they have to do whatever Congress asks them to do. And I believe it's at least one a year.
Maybe one classified and one public.
Exactly. I mean, they definitely have to do one public, but the focus was on history. So I don't know if they're also supposed to release information regarding their current investigations. And a lot of that is supposed to be on their website. I haven't looked at it in a while, but but they're very guarded. You can't really get interviews with them very easily. They're under the control of the Department of Defense. I mean, John Kozlowski made a comment to James Fox, the filmmaker, who's a friend of mine, who actually went and met with him at one point with Kozlowski. And James said it was fine for me to say this publicly. Kozlowski said to him, "I can't even comb my hair without getting permission." Mm-hmm. So it's sort of a frustration on his part that it's so controlled what he can say publicly that it's really not up to him. So if you're hearing from him, you're just hearing what he's approved to say.
Yeah.
He's really not the one that makes that decision, even though he's the head of AARO.
People have pointed to Susan Goff as sort of a chaperone figure. And I don't want to get too conspiratorial. I try to avoid thinking that way. But I have noticed that kind of narrative has been shaping up around her. And I wondered if you have a take on her that could maybe rescue her from some of that implication.
No, I don't know if I can. I don't think I can rescue Susan Goff. No, I have to. I mean, I remember when Kirkpatrick gave a talk and there she was shadowing him and she was right next to him. That's probably what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So she's very much watching everything, and I don't know how much she controls, but her job is to be the public relations spokesperson. So she has to control what gets out publicly. And she's the one that writes, if you want a comment from the Department of Defense around any of this, it comes from her.
Yeah.
And they're usually very bland, very non-specific answers that you get, but you can't go any further than that. So yeah, she's sort of like the gatekeeper in a way.
Yeah.
For AARO and for any Department of Defense related questions that any reporter might have about UAP, it has to go through her.
She also tends to use some language in those blank gatekeeping responses about AARO. Like she tends to put, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I feel myself reaching for a tinfoil hat, but no. I've seen this line a lot from her that starts something like, AARO has not discovered any evidence, blah, 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 blah.
Of anything extraterrestrial. They love to say that.
Yeah, they do. But what seems significant about that statement to me is that AARO is one small department in a vast, sprawling organization that has 2 million employees. And that seems, very different from saying the Pentagon says officially that no program like this has ever existed. Does that do anything for you or not really?
It always goes to AARO because AARO is the Pentagon office that's supposed to be studying this. So really the Pentagon as a broader entity wouldn't even know. They have to put it back to AARO because it's their responsibility to focus on this. So other aspects of the Pentagon, they have no way of knowing what. So it's hard to make a blanket statement for the whole Pentagon.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense it would come from the group tasked with investigating UAP.
Mm-hmm.
But, the line that they haven't discovered any evidence of anything extraterrestrial is sort of a sneaky thing, because what would that look like? I mean, all of the, the high level people who are aware of the phenomenon, they don't say it's extraterrestrial either. It's an unknown, so it's more a question of whether there's evidence that it's non-human technology, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
that there is a non-human intelligence, or that we can't explain how any ourselves or our adversaries could have created this, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not about, we have evidence that they're extraterrestrial. It sort of gives them a way out.
Yeah.
Because that label extraterrestrial has kind of a narrow band, and maybe they're from under the ocean, Maybe they've been living on this planet for a long time. They're not necessarily extraterrestrial. So, it's a sloppy way of sort of, I think, of avoiding answering the real question. And they just repeat it over and over again.
Yeah, I agree.
It's ridiculous. In their report, there's no evidence that, it's just not the point.
You could substitute it with something goofy, like there's no evidence that these objects are from Zlorgon Prime, and it would mean about the same in terms of information.
Yeah, and you can't ever get him in an interview to explain it. There was one interview that Sean Kirkpatrick did with, I think it was with Shane Harris from Washington Post, that was on video, but, you can't press them on any of that because there's no access. It's all through Susan Goff. So you're just sort of stuck.
Before I leave the convoluted world of the Pentagon, I want to ask one more conspiracy-laden question, which is, do you think it's feasible or believable that there might be secure compartmented programs that are not disclosed automatically to department heads? I'm talking about like top secret special access programs, but that because of their need to know basis would not necessarily automatically be disclosed to, say, like an incoming head of the CIA or the Department of Director of National Intelligence. And this is another idea that when I was first encountering this broad subject made me think that that's sort of borderline uncomfortable and maybe a little wild-eyed. But then the more I thought about it, the more it made sense that maybe somebody who's coming into their first day on the job might not automatically get a readout of every need-to-know program in their department. Does that seem like the way that the government or the military works to you, or am I kind of missing something important?
No, I think that's right. I think there are, and I mean, I can't prove this, but just from judging from what people have told me, there are programs that are so high level that people that should have access can't get access. An example being the Wilson memo.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that? And
I am.
Your audience is, but Tom Wilson, the admiral, who was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, could not get access to this program, and he knew about it, but they don't even always know. And my understanding is at high levels of the existence of every single super secret, highly protected, unacknowledged special access program with a small bigot list of people who have access, very specialized. No, they're not going to all know about every single one of those programs. I mean, it makes sense to me. I can't prove that, but that's my sense of it. And that's part of the problem. That's part of what the people advocating for transparency are focused on in Congress, is that there's supposed to be congressional oversight, right? There's supposed to be oversight for all these programs. And so that's when David Grusch came forward, part of his motivation was the illegality of these programs being so black that they're not subjected to oversight, which they're supposed to be. So that's a big problem. So yeah, I mean, it's clear that that's the case, and that's part of why Congress is motivated to try and do something about it.
Wow. It's so interesting just imagining how the lifespan of these programs and how they've been able to, if they have, and continue to exist. Like how
that's the other thing. They're much older than any of the officials that rotate in and out of their jobs. So that's another thing. And they have to determine, is it too risky to inform this particular president about such and such? I mean, there seem to be elements that are in control of those kinds of decisions. It's not the president's decision. Although, as I understand it, the president can ask for a briefing on anything he or she wants.
Mm-hmm.
But most of them don't do that with this. They're busy with a lot of other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
But there may be also decisions made about what's safe to tell a certain official and what isn't, given the nature of that person. Are they the type of person that you can trust or not? All of this kind of consideration goes into it. And you're right. The programs have been going on for so long that they're the people on the outside are just rotating in and out. But these core programs have to be maintained tightly. And, there is the national security element. There's good reason for a lot of that. But I don't think the Congress would agree that they should be exempt from oversight by the congressional bodies that are supposed to know about these things. So that's where we get a threat to our democracy and that kind of thing.
So the view that seems to be shaping up in the community generally of people who are interested in this is that somewhere around the creation of the Defense Department and the CIA and the Air Force in 1947, there were secrets so important to keep in the dawn of the nuclear age that some kind of structure someone created some kind of structure to protect information like this. And those imperatives have kind of traveled through the generations and kept this information from bubbling up to more public venues. Does that sound?
Yeah, I would say that's right. Yeah, because that's when it all started. And, I don't know to what extent there's been an absolute continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some things close down and new ones start up. And I don't know how, none of us can know how that works. But yeah, I mean, it's been going on that long for sure. I mean, back in the Cold War, when they were dealing with these things in the 1950s, there's no way they were going to release anything then when they were dealing with in the Cold War. And it's totally understandable why they wouldn't.
Yeah.
Totally understandable. But there's such an incredible record of sightings and information and memos and government communications from back in the 1950s that reveal that they clearly knew something was going on and these were not ours. And so, yeah, they had to be extremely protective of that information. And to the extent that, it was harmful to regular people sometimes because they used the tool of ridicule to dampen it down. They infiltrated civilian groups. They, did a lot of not very nice stuff to people, made people feel horrible if they reported things, gave them phony explanations for things, all that kind of stuff. But they felt they were doing it because they needed to. And then it seems like it got a little out of control, where even J. Allen Hynek, who was involved for 2 decades with Project Blue Book, who came in as a super skeptic, by the time he left, he was clearly aware of what was going on. And he came out after Blue Book shut down and wrote books about it and became a spokesperson on, what was really going on, which was the hiding of very basic information and the humiliation of witnesses and the lying by the government about what these things actually were. And yeah, so he got to see it firsthand from the inside. So he's been a major figure. Anybody who wants to understand, the history should definitely read Hynek's books.
Yeah, the UFO experience is
that's the main one. Yeah, that's the most important one. Yep. Yeah, and there's a lot of books from that era that are just fascinating. I loved studying the history of that era. But it's so important. And also the most obvious fact about that is people were seeing the same kind of technology then that we see now, right? Nowadays, you can say, well, that could be Russian, Chinese, it could be our secret technology. But back in the 1950s, no.
Yeah.
Nobody on the planet could do that. And nobody's going to dispute that fact. And yet they were seeing the incredible levels of technology that we see now. It was so, That's one reason why the historical record is so important.
I agree.
Yeah, because there was no way that anyone on the planet could do what those things did back then. So
it's fascinating to see that continuity of reporting from like the late 40s, early 50s through then tic-tac-like events in the thousands.
Right, I agree. I love that. And, I remember Lue Elizondo saying that I've seen these documents that people referred to a tic-tac. There weren't any tic-tacs back in the 50s, right? So when they saw that thing, they called it a butane tank.
Sure, yeah.
Or they just call it looking like whatever was in the culture at the time, and it's the same kind of object. You can see it all through history, the same things being seen over and over again.
Eggs and cigars. And
all of it. Triangles, discs. Yep. So it's really fascinating.
It is also fascinating that there was so much coverage especially in the early 50s around the DC flap. And there was just so much more reporting and so much more public conversation and everything until like the Condon report. There's a lot of activity.
There's so much. And I think there was probably more activity actually by the phenomenon than there is now, because now we're going to document it so fast. I don't know if the phenomenon wants to maintain a certain level of distance. They want to show, it wants to show itself, it seems like, but not fully. So back then, people didn't have cell phones. All the things. And it just seems like there was more activity, more close encounters, more reports of people interacting with entities. And then gradually over time, perhaps that has diminished somewhat. We had the Phoenix Lights. We haven't had any major sightings that are irrefutable.
Yeah.
In recent years, right? We had, I guess the last big one was the Nimitz case, and I'm sure there've been others. The Navy pilots are seeing things and so on. But when you think about if something like Phoenix Lights happened now, it would be documented up the wazoo. So it's probably not going to happen if the phenomenon desires to, maintain that kind of anonymity and distance from humans. So, so I don't know. But that's why it's such a rich record of so many rich cases and human encounters that you can read about from the 50s. And the documents from Blue Book are really fascinating to read too. All the files that were released, And you can see that the way the witnesses describe what they saw, and then you see the Blue Book explanation for what they saw, and they just don't match. You can see it right there in the record. It doesn't fit, quite. It just doesn't make sense.
Don't suddenly accelerate.
Something like that. They just wrote them off as easily as they could. So it's just,
I have in mind the Battelle produced Special Report 14 for Project Blue Book. Is that one of the ones that you like? And would you?
Oh yeah, fascinating. I would encourage everyone to read it. Yeah, it's a fascinating report. I remember that one. I haven't looked at it in years, but there's just a lot of great history. And the report that came out of NICAP, I think it was in '68. I have a signed copy of it at home by Richard Hall, who wrote it, but I don't have it right here with me, but I forget what it's called, but it's this, thick report.
Yeah.
Fascinating to read. Just so much data in there.
I agree. Also great.
Yeah, I forget what the UFO, I forget what it was called.
It's UFO not UFO evidence, right?
It might be it, but that's also a book by Richard Hall.
Okay, maybe it's the same title. I've heard you recommend the same
title, but
UFO evidence.
And I wouldn't be surprised if that's available on PDF somewhere in Google. I don't know.
It is actually.
NICAP report,
I found it on the CIA.
It's a great source of information and a way to study that era of reporting that went on and how it was handled. And
I wish NICAP had continued.
Me too. Me too. It was a great operation.
Some of those figures, like Helen Cotter was a really interesting figure. Did you track him at all? I've heard people say he kind of backed off the quest later in life. Does that square with your understanding of his history?
I'm not sure, actually. I don't know. I've read about what he said during that time, but I don't know what happened to later in life. I haven't followed up on that at all. I don't know, but that could be true. That could be true. Yeah. I don't know when he died. And how many, if he was approached later in life, I wasn't aware of that. So
for me, getting into this, finding out that the first CIA head thought, flying saucers are real, and intelligently controlled. That was a big kind of green flag to continue investigating this territory.
Absolutely. There were a lot of people like that, and there always have been. They're not lying. They know things. So
you must have thought in diving into this history about the sort of staggering obstinance of public opinion in the face of all this information and all these reports over the years. Do you have a kind of like big picture theory about why we've been so reluctant to onboard this information?
Well, I think one key aspect is that it takes a lot of time to become informed enough to realize that it's real, right? I mean, it's just a practical thing, so if the culture is very well inculcated with the idea that this is a joke, which is how it was when I started in the year 2000. It's not so much like that now, but it really was just, every time I mentioned this topic to people, they would laugh. It was just like because it was set up that way during the 50s and era, we were just in 60s, that it was ridiculed so much. So it became to be seen in the culture as a joke and as something you might see in the movies and not real. And that was so ingrained that that's a hard obstacle to overcome. And I think the only way you can overcome it is to spend time to study the record, right? Like you've done. But if you haven't done that, you have no way of knowing. Even if you hear somebody interesting say something. So you have to spend the time, and you also have to have the curiosity, the interest to want to know more, right? So most people aren't like that. They just have an opinion based on what everybody else in the culture says. Oh, that's ridiculous. It's, not so much now, I'm saying, but then, and then if something motivates them to learn more, they might have their own sighting. That's a lot of what motivated people, or they just are curious and they start digging into the literature and start reading. Then there's a moment for most people where it's like an aha moment where they finally cross a line and say, my God, there's something going on here. This is real. And then they want to learn more and more, but it's not an easy point to even get to. So I don't hold it against people who don't want to study this or don't have the opportunity to. I just would like them to acknowledge that they're not informed enough to have an opinion, as opposed to having an opinion anyway. Right? The knee-jerk skeptics who just, oh, come on, this is ridiculous, or blah, 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 who know nothing about it, need to have the respect to say, I find it hard to believe, but I'll acknowledge I'm not informed enough to have an opinion. That's all I would ask for people to say. And I respect their choices. A lot of people aren't, I forget sometimes how few people really care about this because I live in a world in which I'm constantly talking to people who are involved at such deep levels. And like, to me, it's like the most important thing there is, right?
Yeah.
But then you walk out in the world and like a lot of people don't even know there was a story in 2017 in the New York Times. They don't even know the government has had congressional hearings or legislation on this. It's like completely foreign to them. I don't know what small percentage of the population even cares or knows. And they all have their reasons for not knowing. So, I don't hold it against anybody. I just get annoyed when people have opinions when they're not informed. Or they're out on a mission to debunk for whatever reason they have to want to do that. They're out on a mission to try to make this look as bad as they can for some personal reason they have. And they're clearly biased. That's not fair either. But at least they're somewhat open about their goal, which is to debunk. They usually admit it. I think it's a lot of factors that affect people in that way. Yeah.
To that point about ridicule and cinema, is there something to the idea that the intelligence community encouraged Hollywood to explore extraterrestrial topics? And then a more broad question, is there something to the idea that intelligence communities can practice campaigns of disinformation through press outlets around the world? I think you may have done some reporting on that second part. Is that right?
Yeah, certainly over the years, I don't know how much it goes on now, but I know they have an influence. I think it's more subtle how they do it now. But yeah, there have been studies done, not by me, but I remember the book by the guy named Terry Hansen, I believe his name was. All about the infiltration of the mainstream media by intelligence people who want to make sure they get their perspective into the way things are reported, not just with UFOs, but other things too.
Sure.
And reporters have to be careful too about national security issues. So they don't want to violate national security. They want to protect the United States if they're they're reporting on something sensitive. They don't want to say the wrong thing. So there has to be some level of control. And yeah, so it's very easy for the intelligence community to impact media, I think. And certainly for the Department of Defense, if they're let's say the national security reporter specialist from a mainstream paper has all these sources within the Department of Defense who are feeding that person a certain type of information, they don't want to risk losing their sources. They want to be cooperative. So it's kind of a conflict of interest. They want to be cooperative with what they're being told. They want to report what they believe the policy of the Department of Defense is. They're very, staying with the mainstream and not looking behind the scenes too much. That's just how it works. So yeah, easy to influence. And I'm sure it happens all the time. That's one of the advantages of being a freelance reporter. Even though it's much harder to publish, you have an independence. There's nobody that can influence me. I mean, I'll take a story to a mainstream outlet. They decide whether they want it or not, but I can't be influenced in the same way I could as if I were working for a paper and on the staff, and I was overseen by different layers of editors and others and had to maintain the sources I had for the benefit of the paper. So I have complete freedom in that regard. Which I'm happy to have, even though it limits my ability to publish as much stuff.
Sure.
It's a trade-off. Yeah, it's a trade-off.
But no one's calling the CEO of the media organization you work at and saying, kill this one.
Exactly. Or, this is way too risky for national security. We can't say this, that, or the other. I mean, I obviously don't want to risk national security, and I never have, and I don't know anything classified, so it's okay, But yeah, so it's totally a problem. I don't know about actual misinformation being fed, falsities being fed to media. I think that has happened in the past. Whether that's happening now, I don't know. But I do think it's more about restraining reporting and making the mainstream media feel very cautious about what they can say and their reputation's at stake and that kind of thing.
What about this idea of encouraging Hollywood? I've heard that kind of like casually batted around, but I don't know if there's anything to it.
Yeah, I don't know really. I mean, I don't think that the intelligence community has control over what Hollywood does. I mean, I think that's really overstated. Like, the people making these movies are independent and they'll just try to make a great movie, and they might consult with some intelligence community members to get information that will help them be accurate or something like that. But if you look at a movie like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, certainly there were connections there, but there were also people like Jacques Vallée and members of the UFO community that provided information for that movie. And it was very realistically portrayed. So I don't think there's any kind of control over Hollywood by the intelligence community. I really don't. I've never kind of bought into that. I mean, it just depends on the movie. It depends on the sensitivity of the movie and what it's about and how much the company wants to consult. But we live in a free world, right? They can make movies about what they want unless they're based on something classified that they can't, shouldn't be releasing, whatever.
Okay, so that's cool. That's kind of
I don't think there's any kind of conspiracy going on to control what Hollywood does. That's
nice. All right.
That's my opinion. I might be wrong. But I've never seen evidence for it. Let's put it that way. I've never heard anyone tell me that there is who's involved with that world.
Okay, that's really good to know. I guess following up on that in a similar vein, I heard you say in another interview that you have checked out some subjects in the UFO world that you didn't end up writing about, partially maybe because you just kind of hit a dead end in terms of your ability to confirm them. And I think you mentioned Majestic 12 on that list. Is that accurate? And do you think there was anything going on there, or did you ultimately conclude that it was either unknowable or that there just wasn't enough evidence?
Yeah, you mean the documents? The majestic,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, that was when I first got into this, and I was finding my way through a lot of stuff back in the year 2000, the first couple of years. And one of the things that I did look into was this, oh my God, there are these documents that say blah, blah, blah. And yeah, it with a lot of things, it gets to a point where you just can't know 100%, right? You can see both sides of the argument, and there's no real definitive conclusion. People you respect are on two opposite sides of a debate. And so I think, what I came to realize with those documents is, I can't report on them because it's not definitive enough. It's just, so that's just how, so there are a lot of things like that I had to learn to just, if it's not going to go anywhere, don't go down that road because it's time consuming.
Mm-hmm.
And I did go down a lot of those roads in the beginning. And that was one of the ways I learned, following with certain people who, were kind of a mixed bag. And, following roads that I could never really get a solid answer on. So yeah, there's a lot of things like that. And it's easy to get sidetracked in the UFO world. And so I had a learning curve there, but I think I learned how to sort of discriminate what's really valuable to focus on and what isn't. If that's what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really good general area to explore, especially for anybody who might just be kind of stepping into this world for the first time. It's a skill set that you kind of have to develop, figuring out how to navigate a world with a lot of dubious claims. And I wonder if you have some general advice on how to think clearly in that difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, I think, now we have so many high-level credible people who have come forward. It's a different world than the one I was in before 2017, or even before my book came out. The first 10 years, oh my God, there was just hardly anybody out there, So what I did was looked for the most credible, most authoritative people I could find, most in a position to know, preferably some people who had clearances, that would really know things, that were willing to come forward. And one of the first people like that I found was a Dr. Richard Haynes, who had an organization called NARCAP, the National Aviation Reporting Center for Anomalous Phenomena. And he was this chief scientist with NASA, who had spent years as a NASA scientist, who had published, dozens and dozens of journal papers on physics and engineering and aviation in, classic leading journals, and was just a well-respected scientist. And then he got interested in this, and he published he started this organization because he was concerned about aviation safety. He knew a lot about the aviation world. He's involved with that world, as he worked with, he had simulators at NASA that pilots would come in and use and stuff like that. He was very involved with aviation. So aviation safety was an issue. And so when this organization started up, and then they published a report, which Dr. Haynes was behind, called Aviation Safety in America, I believe it was called, in 2001 or something like that, documenting, it was, 100 cases or something of aviation safety where a UFO had actually impacted an aircraft in a way that was a aviation safety problem. I mean, there weren't any crashes, but things like pilots having to maneuver suddenly to avoid them, or being pulled off course, by the magnetic or whatever the force is of the object, or the object circling around their plane, all kinds of stuff. And so that was the second story I ever did was based on that. So I could recognize that this is an authority person, right? This is a highly credible person that nobody could ridicule, coming out with this important documents of actual specific flights that are on the record where these things happen. He's interviewed the pilots. He's recorded, he had all these voice recordings with them and stuff. And he's, what more, so that was so that was worth my time to focus on, right? And to study what he was doing and what he had learned, and then do an article based on his report, and then expand that to include just whatever aviation safety cases I could find that might even be independent of NARCAP. But So I did a whole story about aviation safety as a problem. So I don't know if that illustrates, as opposed to following like, the case of a whistleblower on their deathbed who talked about, bodies or, things that nobody can really accept in the mainstream world and may or may not be true. I'm not saying these kinds of things aren't true, but I can't do anything with a deathbed confession about bodies. And yet I could spend a lot of time looking into that case, but I'm not going to. I'm going to go with Richard Haynes. And because my goal was to affect policy and to get members of Congress to pay attention. So I would say to myself, is this something that you could walk into a congressman's office and put on his desk? If it's not, I'm not going to do it. That was sort of my guideline. So for people now, I mean, I'm getting a little sidetracked. I just think it's to look for the most credible, credentialed people who have a history of presenting valid information that have not, have been and are well respected in the community. And there are many people like that now. And I don't know, you just have to, you ask people, but, I mean, a lot of the people, for instance, in the new movie, The Age of Disclosure, are really worth paying attention to. People like Jim Semivan, Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis, Gary Nolan,
Jay Stratton,
the leading lights of people who have been deep on the inside for a long time and who are not liars, and have clearances and know these are the people that I recommend paying attention to. And I also, but there's a whole other level of this, Caleb, which is the experiencer community. And I've become more and more of an advocate for people to pay attention to those people as well. I mean, and one of the things I'm interested in now is finding ways to bring the experiencer aspect of the phenomenon into the mainstream to kind of integrate it more into the nuts and bolts approach, which is what dominates the narrative now. The national, the military basically, Department of Defense dominates the narrative, which is the national security one. And it's all about aviation safety, national security, technology. But there's a whole element, a whole realm of people who have had these close encounters with entities or craft and have been deeply affected by it and have data that's also interesting for us to appreciate and understand and look at. Even though it's not provable in a lot of cases, there are some cases in which there are physical effects, and there are many cases that have been studied by government officials of people who have had these situations. So, that's a whole nother element. And I never, before 2017, even though I was very aware of that and I was interested in the whole abduction world and, people who are working with experiencers, and I met a lot of them, I could never report on it, right? Because we were not there yet. We're getting closer to that now. But so there's a lot. Yeah. So I just wanted to make that point that there's the nuts and bolts. And I think everybody should start with that if somebody's just getting into this. But I also think the experiencer world, and again, that's even more dangerous in terms of what's credible and what isn't, who's credible and who isn't, right?
Yeah.
You don't know what to make of it, but I think we're going to have more and more over time ways of discerning actual data that's going to be produced from that world. And we're going to have better ways of navigating it and really learning from it. There are people working on that now. So I'm excited about that as well.
And that makes sense as a journalistic angle in. If you're just reporting on somebody's experience, that can be pretty tough. It's hard to corroborate. But when you click out a level to this researcher is collecting data about these experiencers and here are their conclusions. Now you've got a story.
Exactly. And there is going to be a study coming out of the John Mack Institute at Rice University that I'm very excited about, which will be something that I would be able to report on. And so, there's a whole group of very talented PhD and scientist people working on it. So, that's what we need. That's what we need. And the Soul Foundation, I think, is also interested in this, and they're doing some work on it. So it's becoming more, more focused and kind of accessible. Yeah, because you're right. You can't just go out and say, well, here's a story about so-and-so, and she says this, No.
Yeah,
it's got to be blocks of data that are correlated and that, And it's understandable because it's a very hard thing to wrap your mind around. Much harder than, oh, there's an object in the sky that we've got on radar and we don't know what it is. That's a lot easier to accept than, oh, hundreds of thousands of people have been interacting with these strange beings with big eyes for forever. How do we know that's even true? We don't have the kind of documentation that we need for that, like we do for the physical objects. So, you got to go in stages with it. But
another principle that kind of dropped out of what you just described there broadly was looking for subjects that you can confirm robustly, or that about which you can gather more information from other avenues, as opposed to focusing on like really narrow cases that ultimately might hit a wall. You want to put things in context with as much surrounding information as possible. Does that sound?
Yeah, definitely. And even if I'm writing about one case, I still want to do that always. And I think that's one of the arguments I make for Ralph Blumenthal and I writing stories is that, as opposed to like just some reporter in the New York Times being assigned something, is that we have the context because I'm informed about the topic. So I can contextualize everything that happens. And a reporter just assigned to cover a congressional hearing, writes a story in one day, can't do that. There's no context at all. And in fact, they may even think that this whole thing sounds pretty weird,
right? Because
they don't have the background information for it. So, so that's a problem with the mainstream too, is that there are very few mainstream reporters who are really informed enough to be able to contextualize it. And to me, that's absolutely essential because you can't understand it otherwise.
And that's a structural note for these media organizations. You can't just assign somebody to the story. You really kind of need to develop a beat. Like you have to give them the job of becoming an expert in the field.
And they're not going to do that with this topic. And that's where I think Ralph and I can come in, is that we are experts in the field. We are on that beat. The papers just have to be willing to run our stories, and the people would love him. As I told you about the New York Times getting the 10th most, the audience, the readers love the stories, but there's a barrier there. It's just not happening. So yeah, it's a frustrating situation.
Yeah, likewise, scientists who spend a lot of time in this area make better candidates for interviews than just like random astrophysicists. I've seen a fair amount of like UFO packages where they're like, well, we talked to a scientist, like we walked onto a college campus and just picked one.
I know, and they're not informed, right?
Right.
It's so true. It just happens all the time, and you can pick who you want in the media. You can pick someone as a naysayer, or you can pick someone who's involved and is in the opposite, and they'll choose who they want.
I think it's one of the good things about this modern era that you've helped usher in is that we're developing a bit of a sort of media roster of people who can go have a good interview and take the other side from Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Exactly, like Gary Nolan. He comes up heavy on Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah.
No, totally. It's true. And I haven't heard as much from Neil deGrasse Tyson lately on this topic. I think he's losing ground there.
That's great. I hope he's doing the work.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a couple of broad things and a couple of narrow things. This is just like with no transition. I'm just curious to close the loop on the Wilson Davis memo. You brought it up earlier, and I wanted to know your takes on the provenance of that memo. Like, is it for real? I guess is the question.
Absolutely for real. Oh yeah. Absolutely, definitely. I have no doubt that that meeting happened as it was reported in that memo.
Okay, for people who aren't familiar, this is an interview between it's Eric Davis, right?
Yes, a physicist, Eric Davis, who worked closely with Hal Puthoff for many years.
Oh, cool! And you're close with all these folks. You've been speaking to them for years.
Mm-hmm.
They discussed the existence of a program, and I believe Admiral Wilson says, if anybody asks me about this, I'll deny it, which is what he's done in real life.
Absolutely denied it. And I think it's an example of what you're saying about people being required to lie. I think he feels required to lie in this situation. And he's done it very well. But that's just how it is. So there you have kind of a he said, she said scenario. Although Eric is not going on the record saying anything, But I will just tell you personally that I have no doubts from what I know from off the record stuff that it's real and it happened as he said. And it's a really important thing for anybody to read. Really, I mean, it's a pretty significant document, and it was entered into the Congressional record too, in one of the hearings. So it's there in the hands of Congress.
That's nice. I hope they do something with it.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
Relatedly, is FOIA still a useful tool for you? I know you've historically done a lot with freedom of information requests. Are you finding that still useful, or have the gates closed a little bit?
I personally haven't been using it. I mean, I did a lot of it on the Kecksburg case when I was involved with that case for years. But we have John Greenwald, who's so on top of it.
Just FOIAing everything.
I just kind of, thank you, John. I take advantage of the work he does or that other people do because it's time consuming. And he's just got his finger on that pulse so beautifully that, there have been some things that have come up lately where I've worked with people who have done some FOIA requests and it didn't come to anything. You just never know. I don't feel like it's predictable. I mean, I think sometimes you get success and sometimes you don't, but it certainly isn't a reliable thing that you can assume you're going to get something that you really think you deserve to have. Power is not in our hands on that, So, so I don't know. I don't think it's that successful. I think it should be doing better than it is in terms of what it reveals, but I'm not an expert on it. So I don't use it that often. It's, but there's one thing I'm looking into where a colleague of mine who was involved in this project with me did write some FOIA requests and the answers were not helpful at all. Let's put it that way. So, you just do the best you can, but
something disappointing that I learned from some scientists that you may know, including Robert Powell, is that the FOIA team stopped giving out radar data. And I think Stephenville maybe was like the last time a citizen scientist was able to get some official government radar data. And I guess the formal explanation of this is that there's so many requests and it's such a hassle that they just stopped doing it because it's hard.
Yeah, time consuming. You mean a blanket, just on a blanket policy now is we never will respond to requests for radar data on anything?
That's my understanding from Robert Powell and Rich Hoffman. But
I wonder if they're allowed to do that. I don't know.
It does seem like pushing it, but maybe pushing it in a place that nobody's paying attention except, SCU. So
SCU is a great organization. So that's pretty shocking.
Yeah, and disappointing. Kind of related, data, government. Have you seen any interesting documents from the National Archives collection that's been kind of like coming in drips and drabs? I know we're not at the deadline yet now because they moved it by a year. But has anything caught your eye?
I haven't seen anything recent, no, but that doesn't mean it's not there. I mean, I may have missed something,
I also
I don't know if John Greenwald has received, or if he's putting out a lot of stuff from that. I don't know. Certainly a lot of the documents that I worked with when I first became involved with this topic that were released like in the 70s, there were tons. They're just fantastic documents that have come out through the Freedom of Information Act, decades ago, that really established the reality of this very clearly, in the 70s. I mean, you read these documents and it's pretty clear that these are real. But it's.
Are you talking about citing documents or like?
Yeah, like case documents, like for instance, the one on the Iranian case with Parviz Jafari. I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but
yes.
He wrote a chapter about it in my book, and the documentation on that case is just phenomenal. That came out through the Freedom of Information Act. So there's a lot of very important documents that have come out. But in recent years, I don't know if you made the point earlier that maybe it's gotten tougher, and that may be the case. I'm just not sure. But we certainly would not be where we are without the FOIA and without the documents that have really been released so far.
Another such case that came up in your book, I think briefly, which is wonderful. Everybody should read UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. If anyone hasn't, please read it. This is the one that I bought for friends and asked
thank you.
Thank you so much for writing it.
Well, thank you for being interested in it. Even though it's 2010, the case reports in there still hold up.
Still really good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although
a lot of them are written by other people too, so they never lose their significance. It's interesting to me about that book is that everything I was advocating for in that book has come to pass.
Yeah, you got your agency.
Yeah, I was advocating for number one, we got to realize these things are real. We got to realize they're an aviation safety issue. And we need to have a government agency to study them, and we need scientists to study them. All those things have happened now since 2017. The government has acknowledged they're real, right? We have an agency that studies them, even though we may not like what it does, but we have it. And scientists are engaging with it, and the government's engaging, and the aviation safety component has been thoroughly realized, officially. So yeah, it's been pretty amazing for me to think back on. That just shows the different world we lived in back in 2010 when I wrote that book. Because for me to say UFOs are real was radical back then. That was the whole radical thing I was saying. I went on a lot of mainstream media when that book came out, and it was all like, wow, maybe they're real. That was like how the book hit people. Maybe these things are real. It's pretty interesting when you think about where we're at today. So that's been really gratifying for me to see the transition that's occurred from then. But I think the book still holds up in that those are some of the best cases on record that are presented. And a lot of them are presented by the actual people involved, not by me.
That was a great idea.
Yeah, I loved having them write their own chapters. And I really love that. And you just hearing them in their own voice and their own style, and a lot of them, I worked closely with all of them because a lot of them had to be translated, and it was a lot of work to do it that way. But I think I loved it. I love that about the book. And I also love the chapter by Alexander Wendt and Duvall towards the end about the taboo and the roots of the taboo. I love that stuff too. So
yeah, it still feels like they nailed it, basically.
They nailed it. And he's writing a whole book now, Alex Wendt is.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I think it'll include that, but a lot more. He's writing a book about the impact of society, the impact that disclosure would have on society if it were to happen. And he takes a pretty negative view that maybe it shouldn't happen because of the impact it would have. But I think he's one of the great thinkers we have. He's a political scientist. We don't have many of those people, but I loved that paper. Actually, their original paper was way more technical and much longer.
Sovereignty of the UFO.
Yes. I forget. Yeah, I had the word sovereignty in it, but and the UFO taboo or something like that. So they wrote I worked with them to write a kind of more accessible, layman's version of that paper, which was what's in my book. Yeah.
You created this primary source document that's definitive and going to stand the test of time. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm so glad that you enjoyed the book.
The thing I was going to mention is I think you have a quick note in there about this thing that happens after the Samford press conference, after the DC flap. They publicly say this is a temperature inversion, which is, probably a pretty silly explanation. But then there have been documents that have come out since then about what they said behind the scenes to internal agencies. And I believe they did not rule out the extraterrestrial hypothesis, for example, when they were talking to like the FBI. Does that sound right to you? Does that ring a bell?
I don't remember exactly, but I'm sure that's the case. I mean, they knew by 1952 that they were dealing with something really exotic, and they knew it wasn't ours, and I don't think they could have imagined it was Russian. I mean, that was the only other option in those days,
right? So
they had to know, but they certainly were not going to come out and acknowledge it. And there's probably good reasons for that, as far as they thought. I mean, they're not like evil people, they had they were trying to protect the country and not get involved with craziness within the Cold War and all that. But
sometimes I think Orson Welles maybe did us an accidental disservice.
I know, right?
People out so much with War of the Worlds.
But there are documents from those early days, which I referenced in my book. And I quoted from a bunch of them, which really, establish from, one agency to another, or one FBI memo to Air Force official so-and-so that, they knew they were dealing with something non-terrestrial, basically. They speculate they're from Mars. I mean, they seem kind of silly, some of them now.
Yeah.
But, and the famous Twining memo too, which everyone should look up.
This is another thing to ask you about the provenance of. You think the Twining memo is legit?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anybody doubts that. Absolutely legit. Yeah. And that's a really key document from that time period.
In which he says the UFO phenomenon is something real and not
fictitious. Yeah, not visionary either. And then he lists all these characteristics of it. It's really, really an important document. Yeah.
The only thing in revisiting your book this week that jumped out as maybe having changed in the last 15 years is there's a photograph from the Belgian wave.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. Great. Because actually in the French edition of the book, which was published after after this guy came forward and said that picture was hoaxed, we actually took it out, and General de Brouwer from Belgium wrote a little piece about it, about why we took it out. In 2011, which was, I guess, about a year after the book came out, and when I was working on this, I just worked with Breakthrough Films, the film company I work with, on a special for History Channel based on the book. And we actually had gone to Belgium, and we got access to the actual slide, and we were like drooling over it, doing interviews we were in the home of not General de Brouwer, but the Patrick, I forget his last name, the key researcher who had looked into all of this. And, I got to hold the slide. It was like the Holy Grail and all this stuff. And then this guy, right before we're going to air the piece, this guy comes out and says he hoaxed that photo. Man. And, it was really like a week before we were going to air the thing, which featured that photo.
Yikes.
I don't know. Yeah. But I think the bottom line of the whole thing is it was not conclusive to the investigators who talked to him and looked into all of this, that it necessarily was a hoax. I mean, it's definitely something that needs to be not seen as evidence anymore, because whenever there's a question like that, you have to get rid of it.
Okay.
But, the guy, I forget his name, but there was another person who owned the rights to that photo who was making a lot of money on it. And the actual shooter was having a fight with him. They were in a huge battle at that time.
Okay.
And so it certainly would have been to his advantage to call it a hoax.
Interesting.
There was that component. Plus, he refused to recreate it for investigators. They asked him, could you recreate how you did it? And he refused to do that. He said, well, the kind of flashlight I use is no longer available, or anything like that. He just would not. But, we don't know. His girlfriend, I guess it was maybe his wife, who was the girlfriend at the time who was supposedly there, also said that he hoaxed it. Whether, we don't know. Again, they could both be lying. So it was sort of left hanging as nobody's really sure whether it was hoaxed or not. So therefore, we explained that in the French edition of the book. But my book hasn't been reissued, so it's not like I'm able to. I mean, I just haven't changed anything in the original book. But but it is that picture, unfortunately, it's now questionable.
Well, maybe for the 25th anniversary edition, you can complicate the subject, including more of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to rewrite it for the publishers. They'd have to repaginate the whole thing. It's just a lot of work and effort to go and do all that. And I'm not sure that the publisher would really want to do that, which costs money and time. And so, whenever I get an opportunity to talk about it, I'm glad to do it. And I think people know out there, most people deeply involved, know that there's a question on that photograph. And I will certainly acknowledge that, but I just haven't done what it takes to republish the whole book,
Sure. I think there's a good chance that sooner or later someone's going to ask you for, an anniversary edition, because it's a major work in the field.
I don't know. We'll see. But I think it's also sort of part of the historical record too, to have that in there, and to have, we quoted scientists in there who had analyzed it, saying they could see nothing, no strings or nothing.
Yeah, right.
So it makes you wonder if the hoaxer really hoaxed it. And I don't think we'll ever know.
It's such an interesting possibility you raised about the the phenomenon being skittish and maybe backing off as the years go by. My brother John calls this the kind of careful problem. Why are they?
Oh, really?
Yeah. How come they show up sometimes, but then they're not?
Not all the way.
landing on the
They're not
lawn?
landing on the White House lawn, obviously.
Yeah.
And the more sensory equipment we have to capture them, maybe the more elusive they're going to be, depending on, I mean, they're the ones in control. We forget that. They are in control. They are way more powerful than we are. It's up to them, whatever happens.
That's
I
frustrating
don't think
too.
people like to face that fact.
No, it's easier to get frustrated at Congress.
And that's where it can also get scary for people. And that's sort of what Alexander Wendt was pointing to in his essay too. That's where it gets psychologically scary, that we're not the top of the food chain here. We don't have, we're not in control the way we think we are. There's another species or another intelligence that's more sophisticated than we are, that's here. And we've never thought of ourselves that way.
Well, maybe let's dip into this before I have one more question for our outro, but briefly on the phenomenon. I've heard you say elsewhere that the longer you've researched this, the more it's been a little bit unsettling to you, and that rather than feeling hunky-dory about it 25 years down the rabbit hole, you might feel uneasy in some ways about the nature of the phenomenon. And I just wondered if you wanted to explore that briefly.
Yeah, I mean, it's more like Lue Elizondo has said, it's when you learn the facts, it's very sobering. He has given us an impression that it's not, there's very disturbing elements about it, but I don't know what those are specifically, because they're information that I don't have access to. But just from people I've talked to, I mean, we human beings are basically destroying our planet, and we're not, and it's even worse now that we have a president who doesn't even believe climate change is real and is trying to do everything he can to shut down the EPA and all this stuff. We are destroying the physicality of our planet, and whatever resources are here, we're using them all up, and animals are going extinct and all this. And if there is, if the non-human intelligence is any way attached to our planet, they may not want to see us destroy it. So, it's sort of a thought about, it's all theoretical and kind of speculative, but they are super powerful, right? They can do whatever they want. And so you just wonder if they're going to allow that to happen or not. Number one. And number two, if indeed they have bases under the ocean or whatever, like a lot of people think now, they have a vested interest in our planet. And they have been making sorties over nuclear power plants, as everybody knows, and maybe giving us a message there. We don't know if that's a message or not. But so it's just this sense of sort of ominous future. How are they going to respond to this overpopulated planet destroying itself? And, Lue even speculates in his book about a potential invasion or them doing something dramatic to try to address that situation. And he remember that part of the book where he sort of lists it's towards the end. I don't remember specifically, but so it's just little things I hear about like that, and I think about, if this intelligence is here and they're interacting with our planet and they're involved with our planet, maybe they're not happy with how we're behaving. And who knows what that might mean for us as a species, because they can do whatever they want with us. So it's that kind of thinking. And I think I think people that know the inside scoop on the information have a lot of concerns. I just know this from intelligence people I've talked to who have real concerns about our future with respect to that. So it's just something I reflect about and think about. But I can't say anything specific about it, and I'm not encouraging people to be terrified about the end of the world or something like that. But there's a sobering, as Lue says, there's sobering aspects, there's somber aspects to this. There's things to be concerned about on a sort of an existential level for our, for our species. And if we're not taking seriously things like the destruction of the planet, we're in trouble.
Well, I think that pivots me well toward a closing question here, which is, what do you think we should do as individuals in this environment? I'm going to spool that out a little bit. In the face of increasing disclosure, many of us might be left feeling helpless, the feet of an unimaginably large quandary, similar to the scale and threat of climate change or nuclear destruction. And I'm sharing a question from my friend here, which is why it sounds like I'm reading it. But what can the average person who comes into this knowledge do to activate themselves or their community in a positive way? How can they help transmute their bewilderment and fear and anger into awe, joy, and action?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, that's what got me going, was the awe factor, and I still have that. But I would say, it's very important for people to push for greater transparency, right? Because knowledge is power. The more we know, even if it's something ominous, the more we know, the better off we are. We don't want to avoid it, right? We have a right to be informed about basic truths, even if we don't get access to the specific national security data that relates to technology that we don't want our adversaries to have. We all agree with that. But the basic truths, that we're not alone, and whatever else might be known about that we have a right to that information, right? So I think people need to be pushing for that. And that one way to do that, of course, is through your representatives in Congress, writing to them. I mean, I know, it's, people think they're not going to care, but they do. The more they hear from their constituents, the better, and a lot of it too is about talking to other people and joining some of the groups that are out there too. If people feel alone and kind of scared and disoriented and don't know what to do, you can hook up with various groups where you'll feel a sense of community with this business, which is really important. And you can contribute as well as learn from that and feel supported, right? So try to become part of a network. And I think there are going to be some broader networks that are going to be developed over this year, even. But there's so many different groups now, that people can, depending on what their particular focus is or what their particular interest is. If they're a scientist, they can work with SCU. There's the Soul Foundation. There's the John Mack Institute for Experiencers. I would encourage all experiencers to connect with them. So find your community. I think that's really important. I don't know if that helps. And then push for greater transparency in whatever way you can, and try to educate the people around you as best you can. If someone's a skeptic, I mean, just give them something really basic. Like, I know that the series that I helped produce was kind of organized, kind of meant for that, especially season 1. It's like a primer. And I know people who have seen that who were completely uninterested, or they just watched it because they knew me, right? Or even skeptical, and I have as one friend in particular who was completely transformed by just seeing that series. Absolutely got it. You can't watch that and not get that there's something real going on, right?
Yeah.
And she's now obsessed with the topic. So, if you can just share things like that, something that maybe someone is willing to pay attention to, just one thing that's very basic, that kind of shows them some of the basics of this. It's not tinfoil hatty. It's not going into encounters with gray aliens. It's just the nuts and bolts stuff. Mm-hmm. And the history of it. We also cover that a lot in that series. That's one thing people can do, just try to educate other people. But I think everyone needs to realize there's a community of people out there, and it's growing. And anyone who wants to can become part of that community by just finding the organizations that are of interest to them, Can't be out there alone with this stuff. It's way too hard. But I would recommend that season 1 of Investigating the UFOs Investigating the Unknown, which is on Hulu, as you mentioned, as being, and I'm not just saying this because I'm involved with it, I really think it's objectively a very good primer for the person who doesn't know anything. It really serves that purpose well, as my book does. But my book is now, dated. This series is much more up to date. It includes, the role that Congress has been playing and so on. So, I just think it's a good tool. But I hope that answers your question. I mean, this is the most important issue facing our civilization, as I see. I mean, climate change is super important. They're all interconnected, but this is an existential issue, and we don't know the implications it could have if we learn more about it. Maybe they would be positive. Maybe we will learn more about how to manufacture, like some people advocate for energy development and so on. The technology could be very beneficial to humanity if it's managed in the right way. So we don't know where it's going to go, but it's extremely important. And to the extent that we can connect with other people on that and create more of a movement on it, a unified movement, I think that's where we're heading. And I would encourage everybody to become part of that.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer.
I do the best I can. And listen to podcasts like this. There's so many great people that you can learn from who are doing podcasts now.
Yeah, true.
There's so much information out there. You just have to, find the right ones and connect with the people that interest you the most. And there's a lot you can learn very quickly now. Post 2017, it's a different world. So.
And I strongly endorse this show. Not like anybody needs my endorsement, but do check out UFOs Investigating the Unknown, both seasons on Hulu. The second season, you even get into a little experiencer stuff in the
exactly. That was a big breakthrough, and that's part of my effort to try to integrate that a little bit more into the broader narrative. So I did that. Started off with that by in that series. And it's gotten a really good response. I mean, we try to do it in a very credible way, with therapists and anthropologists and so on. And I think it was successful. I think it worked. So I was very proud of being able to do that. We couldn't do that in season 1, but season 2 was the perfect place for it.
I agree with you that this whole thing is a great primer. It's a great thing to give somebody who's just starting and needs to get the bigger picture. You're going to really hold their hand very carefully through it in a way that will bed in the reality for them.
I think it's true. And it's fun. They can sit back and enjoy watching it, be passive and just take it in, So yeah, I hope it serves that purpose. I know it has for a lot of people. So thank you for endorsing it.
Thank you so much for your time. Is there a place where you like people to reach out or engage with you online, or just watch your stuff and buy your books?
Yeah, I mean, I used to be very active on Facebook. I just feel so bad that I'm just not on social media anymore. And
good for you.
I have a huge following on Facebook, and I was constantly engaging in conversations with people, and I really enjoyed it. But I don't know, the last year or two, I've just been busy, and I just haven't. Sometimes everything is so overwhelming that I don't know what to put on Facebook anymore. And Facebook's kind of obsolete anyway. Everybody's on X now. So I'm basically not there. I mean, I have a website and I try to keep that up to date. So if it's just my name.com. So people can go to my website. That's probably the best place. And all of my media stuff eventually ends up there, and the books are there, and the, other supporting stuff and things I've written are there. So that's probably the best thing to do, but I have to update it. It's probably a year or 6 months at least out of date. And so I'll do that, but I'm not a major social media person by any means. I'll just leave that to other people to do.
Well, thank you for sharing so much of your precious time with us today.
Very happy to do it, Caleb. Nice to be on your show, and good luck continuing forward. I'm glad you're involved with this work and that you're offering a platform to people. So keep going.
And that's the show. Thank you for watching or listening. If you'd like to subscribe to the show, you can do that on patreon.com/WTUFO or on YouTube or on Buzzsprout. You can support us for as much or as little per month as you would like to. We really appreciate anything that you can contribute. Also, you can check out Spacefair's shop at spacefair.etsy.com. Thank you again for watching or listening. I hope you have a beautiful day.